Commander Zethkar had seen enough battlefields to fill a dozen lifetimes. His chitinous exoskeleton bore the scars of plasma burns from the Vorthan campaigns, deep gouges from mercanti claws during the Outer Rim conflicts, and the telltale pockmarks of shrapnel from the brutal siege of Cathara Prime. Each mark told a story of survival, of pushing through pain that would have broken lesser warriors. The Galactic Council had assigned him to Earth as a military advisor, a role he accepted with the weary resignation of someone who had climbed every mountain of warfare the galaxy had to offer. Humans, they said, were the newest members of the galactic community, fresh-faced primitives who had barely mastered faster than light travel. They needed guidance, structure, and most importantly, they needed to understand what real combat looked like. Zethkar's transport ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, and he watched the blue and green world grow larger through the viewport. Pretty enough, he supposed, though he had learned not to judge worlds by their beauty. Some of the most vicious battles he had fought were on worlds that looked like paradise from orbit. The human delegation that met him at the landing pad was exactly what he expected. Soft-looking bipeds with pale skin and strange hair covering their heads. They wore simple uniforms, without the battle modifications he was used to seeing among seasoned warriors. No visible scarring, no cybernetic replacements for limbs lost in combat, no ritual markings that proclaimed their victories over fallen enemies. "Commander Zethkar," said their leader, a human who introduced himself as General Morrison. "Welcome to Earth. We're honored to have a warrior of your reputation here to help us understand galactic warfare standards." Zethkar clicked his mandibles in acknowledgement. At least they showed proper respect. "General Morrison, your species has an impressive record of rapid technological advancement. However, technology alone does not make warriors. I am here to assess your military capabilities and provide guidance based on my experience across 47 different war zones." As they walked through the military compound, Zethkar noted the humans' equipment: basic kinetic weapons, primitive armor systems, and vehicles that looked like they could barely survive a skirmish with pirates, let alone a real military engagement. Everything was so clean, so unmarked by battle. These people had clearly never faced serious combat. "Tell me about your military history," Zethkar said, as they entered a briefing room. "What conflicts have shaped your understanding of warfare?" The humans exchanged glances that Zethkar recognized. It was the look soldiers gave each other when they were about to discuss something painful. Good. At least they understood that war was not a pleasant topic. General Morrison activated a holographic display. "Well, Commander? Human history has been marked by numerous conflicts. We've had 2 major global wars, countless regional conflicts, and various smaller engagements throughout our development." Zethkar studied the display with growing bewilderment. The numbers were wrong. The timeframes were impossible. According to the data, these global wars had lasted for years, not the standard few months that marked most interstellar conflicts. And the casualty figures. They had to be mistakes. "General, there appears to be an error in your historical records. This data suggests millions of casualties in single conflicts. That cannot be correct." "I'm afraid it is, Commander. The first global war resulted in approximately 17 million military and civilian deaths. The second global war saw around 70 to 85 million casualties." Zethkar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a reflexive response to processing contradictory information. "You are telling me that your species fought wars that killed millions of your own kind? On a single planet? With primitive weapons?" "That's correct. And those are just the major conflicts. We've had numerous other wars throughout our history, many lasting decades." The alien commander felt something he had not experienced in years: confusion that bordered on disbelief. In galactic warfare, conflicts were typically resolved quickly. Superior technology or tactics would decide the outcome within weeks or months at most. Prolonged wars were considered wasteful and inefficient. But these humans were describing something else entirely. "Show me more details about these conflicts," Zethkar demanded. What followed was 3 hours of the most disturbing military history Zethkar had ever encountered. The humans described wars fought in trenches filled with mud and corpses, where soldiers lived for months in conditions that would break the spirit of most galactic species within days. They spoke of battles where the objective was to gain mere meters of ground, fought over and over until the earth was churned into a mixture of soil and blood. They described winters so harsh that soldiers lost limbs to frostbite, yet continued fighting. They told him about sieges that lasted for years, where defenders ate rats and boiled leather just to survive another day. They explained how entire cities were reduced to rubble, and how civilians continued to resist even when faced with certain death. "This is impossible," Zethkar said finally, his voice carrying a tremor that surprised him. "No species fights under such conditions. No rational military force would accept such casualties for such marginal gains. You are describing a level of persistence that defies logic." General Morrison leaned forward. "Commander, may I ask about your own military experience? What was the longest single engagement you've participated in?" Zethkar straightened with pride. "The Siege of Cathara Prime. 18 days of continuous combat. It was considered one of the most brutal extended conflicts in recent galactic history. The casualty rate reached nearly 30% before the defending forces surrendered. The silence in the room was deafening. "Commander," said another human officer, Colonel Hayes, "we have documented battles from our second global war that lasted for months. Single engagements where the casualty rate exceeded 90%, and the survivors continued fighting. That is impossible. No military unit maintains cohesion with such losses." Colonel Hayes activated another display. "The Battle of Stalingrad lasted for 5 months. Urban combat, house to house, room to room. Soldiers fought with rifles, knives, and eventually their bare hands when ammunition ran out. The casualty rate for some units reached 100% multiple times as they were reinforced and wiped out again." Zethkar stared at the display, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Images of human soldiers fighting in the ruins of a city that looked like it had been hit by orbital bombardment. Except these weapons were primitive, the devastation created by sustained ground combat over months of fighting. "You fought for 5 months? In those conditions? Without retreat?" Neither side could retreat. Too much was at stake. What could possibly be worth such sacrifice? The humans looked at each other again, and Zethkar saw something in their expressions that made his exoskeleton prickle with an emotion he could not name. "Survival," General Morrison said simply. "The survival of our way of life, our families, our future. When everything you care about is threatened, you find strength you didn't know you had." Zethkar left the briefing room in a daze. Everything he thought he knew about warfare, about what was possible in combat, had been shattered in a single afternoon. These humans, these soft-looking creatures with their primitive weapons and clean uniforms, had fought wars that would have broken the most hardened galactic veterans. That night, alone in his quarters, Zethkar stared at his reflection in the mirror. His scars, which had once been sources of pride, now seemed almost decorative. 18 days at Cathara Prime had nearly broken him. These humans spoke of years of such fighting as if it were simply what one did when circumstances demanded it. For the first time in his long military career, Commander Zethkar began to question whether he truly understood what it meant to be a warrior. And for the first time in years, he felt something that his scarred exterior had convinced him was impossible. Fear. Not fear of death or injury, but fear of the implications of what he had learned. If humans could endure what they had described, if they could fight under conditions that would destroy any other species he knew, then what exactly had the Galactic Council invited into their community? What kind of warriors had they unleashed upon the galaxy? The thought kept him awake through the long Earth night, and when morning came, he found himself eager to learn more. Not to teach these humans about warfare, but to understand how they had survived wars that should have been impossible to fight, let alone win. The battle-scarred alien warrior, who had arrived to instruct primitive humans in the ways of galactic combat, realized he might be the student instead. Commander Zethkar arrived at the training facility the next morning, with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Sleep had eluded him as questions multiplied in his mind. The humans had agreed to demonstrate their military training methods, and he found himself genuinely curious, rather than dismissive. General Morrison met him at the entrance, flanked by several other officers whose names Zethkar was beginning to remember. These humans seemed determined to treat him as an honored guest, which only added to his growing discomfort. How could he maintain his superior position when everything he had learned the previous day suggested these people had endured trials that would have destroyed him? "We thought you might want to observe some of our training exercises," Morrison said as they walked toward a series of obstacle courses. "Nothing too advanced, just basic conditioning that every soldier goes through." Zethkar nodded, expecting to see the usual military fitness routines he had observed on dozens of worlds. Physical conditioning was universal among galactic militaries, though most species had developed efficient technological aids to supplement natural abilities. The first shock came when he saw the training equipment. It was primitive to the point of being crude. Heavy objects that soldiers lifted repeatedly, lengthy tracks they ran around without any mechanical assistance, and obstacle courses that seemed designed to cause injury rather than efficiently build strength. "Where are your enhancement chambers?" Zethkar asked. "Your neural link trainers? Your muscle stimulation units?" Colonel Hayes, who was leading the facility tour, looked confused. "We don't use any of those, Commander. Our training is mostly physical conditioning, weapons practice, and tactical exercises. But how do you achieve optimal physical enhancement without proper equipment? How do you develop the reflexes necessary for modern combat?" 8. "We train every day. For months, sometimes years. Repetition, endurance, and pushing past our limits." Zethkar watched as a group of human soldiers began their morning routine. They started by running what appeared to be several kilometers around the facility perimeter, not sprinting for short distances as galactic troops did when testing their enhanced reflexes, but maintaining a steady pace that suggested they could continue for extended periods. The alien commander timed them carefully. After 30 minutes, they were still running. After an hour, most were still maintaining their pace. This was impossible. Without enhancement drugs or genetic modifications, no natural species could sustain such activity. "How long do they typically run?" he asked. "This is a light day. Usually about 90 minutes. On heavy training days, they might run for 3 or 4 hours. 3 or 4 hours? Without stopping? Without enhancement aids?" "That's standard endurance training, Commander. Every soldier needs to be able to march for days if necessary, carrying full equipment loads." Over. Zethkar felt his mandibles click involuntarily. In galactic militaries, enhanced exoskeletons or implanted systems handled extended movement. Natural endurance was considered inefficient when technology could provide superior results. When the running concluded, the humans moved to strength training. Zethkar expected to see sophisticated equipment that would efficiently build muscle mass through calculated stimulation. Instead, he watched soldiers lifting crude iron weights, doing push-ups against gravity alone, and performing exercises that seemed designed to cause maximum strain with minimum technological assistance. "This seems unnecessarily difficult," Zethkar observed. "Why not use enhancement systems to achieve better results in less time?" "Because the equipment might fail," Morrison replied. "Or it might not be available. A soldier needs to know their own natural capabilities. They need to understand what their body can do without any assistance." "But surely you have backup systems, redundancies." "Commander, may I show you something?" Morrison led him to another section of the facility where soldiers were practicing what humans called field exercises. Zethkar watched as troops carried heavy packs across difficult terrain, set up camps using only basic tools, and prepared meals over open fires. Where are their portable shelters? Their nutrition synthesizers? Their environmental control systems? They're learning to survive with minimal equipment. In actual combat, supply lines get disrupted, technology fails. Soldiers need to know how to stay alive using whatever resources they can find. Zethkar observed a group of soldiers constructing what appeared to be a shelter using nothing but branches, mud, and some kind of fabric covering. It was crude, primitive, and would provide only basic protection from the elements. Yet the humans worked with practiced efficiency, as if they had done this countless times. This level of primitive training, it seems excessive. Surely modern warfare does not require such basic survival skills. Morrison and Hayes exchanged another of those looks that Zethkar was learning to recognize. The look that said they were about to share something he would not want to hear. Actually, Commander, would you like to meet some veterans from our more recent conflicts? They walked to a different building where several older humans were engaged in what appeared to be instructional activities with younger soldiers. These humans bore visible signs of combat. Scars, missing limbs replaced with mechanical substitutes, and the particular way that experienced fighters moved through space. Morrison introduced him to a human named Sergeant Williams, whose right arm had been replaced with a mechanical prosthetic. Sergeant Williams served 3 tours in Afghanistan, mountain warfare in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Sergeant, Zethkar said formally, perhaps you could describe the conditions you encountered in combat. Williams studied the alien commander for a moment, and Zethkar felt like he was being evaluated. This human had the same look he had seen in the eyes of other veteran warriors across the galaxy, the quiet assessment of someone who had faced death repeatedly and learned to recognize it in others. Well, sir, the mountains were rough. Elevations where the air is so thin that newcomers can barely function. Temperatures that would drop below freezing at night, then climb to dangerous heat during the day. We carried everything we needed on our backs, sometimes for weeks at a time. Weeks? Without resupply? That was normal, sir. We'd patrol for 30 or 40 days at a time, living on what we carried and what we could find. Fighting at altitudes where every breath was work. In terrain where one wrong step could send you falling down a cliff face. Zethkar felt a familiar tremor in his limbs. How long were you deployed to this environment? 15 months, sir. Each tour. 3 tours total. 15 months. In conditions that required constant survival skills. Fighting an enemy in their own territory. Yes, sir. And that was pretty standard. Some of my buddies did 4 or 5 tours. The alien commander tried to process this information. In galactic military doctrine, extended deployments in hostile environments were limited to a few weeks at most. The psychological and physical toll of extended combat operations was considered too dangerous for unit cohesion. Sergeant, may I ask, how did you maintain morale under such conditions? How did your units remain functional for such extended periods? Williams smiled, but it was not a happy expression. You just do what needs to be done, sir. Your brothers are depending on you, and you're depending on them. You find ways to keep going because stopping isn't an option. Another veteran, introduced as Captain Rodriguez, joined the conversation. She walked with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. Commander, if you don't mind me asking, what's the standard deployment length for galactic military units? Typically 3 to 6 weeks for active combat operations. Extended deployments are considered psychologically damaging and militarily inefficient. The humans looked at each other with expressions that Zethkar could not quite interpret. Sir, Captain Rodriguez said carefully, our second global war lasted 6 years. Soldiers often deployed for the entire duration. Some units saw continuous combat for years without rotating out. That is impossible. No military force could maintain effectiveness under such conditions. We had to, sir. The alternative was losing everything. Zethkar felt something cold settle in his thorax. You are telling me that your soldiers fought continuously for years? Without psychological intervention? Without rotation to safe areas for recovery? That's right, sir. And they didn't just fight. They advanced, took territory, held positions under constant attack, and ultimately won. The alien commander found himself needing to sit down. A helpful human provided a chair that was almost the right size for his physiology. Around him, the veterans continued to share stories that shattered every assumption he had made about sustainable military operations. They spoke of soldiers who fought in jungles where disease was as dangerous as enemy fire, where the humidity rotted equipment and made every breath a struggle. They described battles in deserts where water was more valuable than ammunition, and where sandstorms could last for days. They told him about urban warfare, where soldiers fought room to room through cities filled with civilians, where every window could hide a sniper, and every basement could contain an ambush. They explained how they learned to sleep while under bombardment, to eat while under fire, and to continue fighting when wounded. But your casualties, Zethkar said weakly. The psychological trauma alone should have broken these units. It did break some people, Captain Rodriguez said quietly. War always does. But the ones who could keep going, did keep going, because they had to. The human military has extensive support systems for psychological trauma, General Morrison added. We learned that taking care of our people's mental health was just as important as treating their physical wounds. But you still expected them to fight under impossible conditions. We expected them to do their job, Sergeant Williams said. Same as soldiers everywhere, I imagine. The difference might be that we learned not to underestimate what people can endure when they have no choice. As Zethkar left the Veterans Building, his worldview had shifted so dramatically that he felt disoriented. These humans had not just survived conditions that would have destroyed galactic military units. They had thrived under them. They had developed training methods that prepared their soldiers for hardships that most species had never even imagined. That evening, he sent his first report back to the Galactic Council. It was supposed to be an assessment of human military capabilities and recommendations for their integration into galactic defense forces. Instead, he found himself writing something entirely different. A recommendation that the Council study human military doctrine, not to teach humans how to fight like the rest of the galaxy, but to learn how humans had achieved what everyone else considered impossible. The battle-scarred veteran who had come to instruct primitive humans realized that he was in the presence of a warrior culture that made his own achievements seem small by comparison. And tomorrow, he would ask to see more. The third day of Commander Zethkar's visit began with a request that surprised the human delegation. Instead of observing more training exercises, the alien warrior asked to visit what humans called their military museums and memorials. He wanted to understand the context behind the impossible stories he had been hearing. General Morrison seemed pleased by the request. I think that's an excellent idea, Commander. Understanding our history is crucial to understanding our military culture. Their first stop was a memorial dedicated to soldiers from what humans called the Vietnam War. Zethkar studied the black wall covered with thousands of names, each representing a human who had died in a conflict he was only beginning to understand. This war lasted how long? He asked quietly. For the United States, active involvement lasted about 20 years. For the Vietnamese people, the conflict stretched much longer. 20 years? Zethkar's mandibles clicked rapidly. The longest conflict in recorded galactic history lasted 14 months. How could any civilization sustain warfare for 20 years? A human veteran named Thompson, who served as a guide at the memorial, overheard the question. Sir, if I may, when everything you believe in is threatened, time becomes irrelevant. You fight for as long as it takes. Thompson led them through exhibits that showed the conditions soldiers had faced. Dense jungle warfare where visibility was measured in meters, tunnel systems where combat took place in spaces barely large enough for a human to crawl through, and operations that continued through monsoon seasons that lasted for months. The soldiers here fought in an environment where the forest itself was an enemy, Thompson explained. Diseases, insects, heat, humidity, and an opponent who had been fighting in this terrain for decades. Many of our soldiers were teenagers who had never been outside their home states. Zethkar stared at images of young humans, barely adults by galactic standards, carrying equipment through swamplands that looked hostile to all life. How old were your soldiers? Many were 18 or 19 years old, some even younger who lied about their age to enlist. You sent children into combat conditions like these? They weren't children once they completed training, Thompson replied. Age became irrelevant pretty quickly in the field. What mattered was whether you could depend on the person next to you. The alien commander felt his exoskeleton trembling slightly. In galactic militaries, soldiers were not considered ready for serious combat until they had reached full physical and mental maturity, usually equivalent to human mid-20s at minimum. The idea of 18-year-olds enduring the conditions he was seeing seemed not just dangerous but impossibly cruel. Their next stop was a World War II museum, where Zethkar encountered displays that challenged his understanding of what warfare could become. Artifacts from the Battle of Stalingrad that he had heard about the previous day, but also exhibits from other engagements that seemed equally impossible. A section dedicated to the Pacific Theater showed him amphibious assaults, where humans had stormed heavily fortified beaches under withering fire. Images of soldiers wading through surf while being shot at, climbing over obstacles while carrying heavy equipment, and advancing across open ground where casualties exceeded 50% in the first few minutes. "This is not rational military doctrine," Zethkar said to Morrison. "No competent commander orders direct assaults against prepared positions with such casualty projections." "Sometimes there were no alternatives," Morrison replied. "These islands had to be taken to continue the advance toward the enemy homeland. Every day we delayed meant more civilian deaths and a longer war." They showed him exhibits from the European theater. D-Day landings where thousands of soldiers jumped from aircraft into enemy territory, knowing that many would die before reaching the ground. Tank battles that lasted for weeks across hundreds of kilometers of territory. Infantry advances through countryside where every village had to be fought for house by house. But it was the Holocaust exhibit that finally broke through Zethkar's ability to process what he was learning. The systematic murder of millions of civilians, and the human response to discovering these atrocities, forced him to confront something he had never considered: warfare motivated by absolute moral imperatives, rather than territorial or resource disputes. "Your species fought this war not just for strategic advantage," he said slowly, "but because you discovered acts so evil that stopping them became more important than your own survival." "That's right," Morrison confirmed. "When we liberated the concentration camps and saw what had been done, there was no question that this enemy had to be completely defeated, no matter the cost. But the casualties, the resources expended. From a purely military perspective, the costs were unsustainable." "Commander," said Dr. Sarah Chen, the museum's head historian, "there are things more important than military efficiency. Some fights have to be fought regardless of cost, because not fighting them means accepting something unacceptable." Zethkar studied a display showing American soldiers sharing their food rations with concentration camp survivors, even though those soldiers had been on reduced rations themselves for months. The images showed humans who looked exhausted and worn, yet they were giving what little they had to complete strangers. This behavior, it contradicts every logical military doctrine. Soldiers weakening themselves to help non-combatants serves no strategic purpose. End quote. Dr. Chen smiled sadly. "It serves a purpose that isn't military, Commander. It serves the purpose of remaining human while fighting inhuman enemies." The museum's final exhibit covered more recent conflicts: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and dozens of smaller operations that had taken place across the globe. Zethkar learned about soldiers who had served multiple deployments in urban warfare environments, fighting enemies who used civilians as shields and operated from schools, hospitals, and residential areas. "How do your soldiers maintain discipline when fighting under such conditions?" he asked. "When the enemy deliberately uses civilian populations as tactical assets, training, leadership, and understanding why we fight," answered Colonel Hayes, who had joined them for this part of the tour. "Our soldiers learn to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants even under stress, even when being shot at from concealed positions. But this creates massive tactical disadvantages. You are essentially fighting with self-imposed restrictions that your enemies do not follow. Yes, it does create disadvantages, but maintaining those standards is part of what we're fighting to protect. If we abandon them, we become like the enemies we're fighting against." Zethkar spent a long time staring at a display showing American soldiers providing medical care to wounded enemy fighters. In galactic warfare, treating enemy wounded was considered a waste of resources that could endanger your own forces. "You treat enemy soldiers who were trying to kill you moments before? Medical care for prisoners of war is required by our laws and military codes," Hayes explained. "But more than that, it's the right thing to do. They're someone's son or daughter, fighting for what they believe in, just like our soldiers are." As they left the museum, Zethkar felt as though his understanding of warfare had been completely reconstructed. These humans had not just survived impossible conditions. They had maintained moral standards that would have been abandoned by most galactic militaries as soon as they became inconvenient. That evening, General Morrison invited Zethkar to join him for what humans called a barbecue, with active duty soldiers and their families. The alien commander found himself in the strange situation of sharing a meal with warriors who had fought in some of the conflicts he had been learning about, along with their spouses and children. The soldiers spoke casually about deployments that would have been considered epic ordeals by galactic standards. A young sergeant mentioned spending 13 months in Afghanistan, as if it were a routine assignment. A captain talked about her third deployment to Iraq while helping her daughter with homework. "How do your families endure such extended separations?" Zethkar asked. "It's hard," admitted the captain's spouse. "But we know the job is important, and we support each other through it." Military families learn to be strong. Zethkar watched children playing nearby, apparently untroubled by the fact that their parents regularly deployed to dangerous places for extended periods. In galactic society, such family structures would be considered unstable and potentially traumatic for offspring. As the evening progressed, he found himself in conversation with Master Sergeant Jackson, a veteran of multiple deployments, who had lost a leg to an improvised explosive device, but had continued his military service in a training capacity. "Sergeant, may I ask, why do you continue serving after such an injury? Surely you have earned the right to retire." Jackson looked surprised by the question. "Sir, I can still contribute. I can train new soldiers, share what I've learned, help keep people alive when they deploy. Why would I stop doing something I'm good at just because I got hurt? But surely the trauma, the difficulty of adaptation to your injury." "It was difficult," Jackson admitted. "But I had help. My unit, my family, the medical staff, counselors. Nobody goes through something like that alone. And once you realize you can still make a difference, the injury becomes just another obstacle to work around." Zethkar looked around the gathering and realized he was seeing something that existed nowhere else in the galactic community. A warrior culture that had learned to thrive under conditions that would destroy other civilizations, while maintaining bonds of loyalty and care that extended beyond military necessity. Late that night, he completed his final report to the Galactic Council. It was not the assessment they had expected. "Council members," he wrote, "I must inform you that our assumptions about human military capabilities have been fundamentally incorrect. These are not primitive warriors who need our guidance. They are the products of a military tradition that has evolved under conditions of unprecedented hardship and moral complexity. Human soldiers routinely endure deployments that would break galactic units. They fight under restrictions that would be considered tactically insane by our standards. Yet they win their conflicts. They have developed training methods that prepare them for situations our military doctrine considers impossible. Most importantly, they have learned to maintain their humanity while fighting inhuman enemies. They treat prisoners with respect, protect civilians at personal risk, and care for their wounded even when resources are scarce. My recommendation is that we do not teach humans how to fight like the rest of the galaxy. Instead, we should learn from them. If the time comes when the galactic community faces a truly existential threat, I believe human military doctrine and human warriors may be our greatest asset. The scars they carry are not signs of weakness or poor tactics. They are proof that humans can survive and triumph in circumstances that would destroy any other species we know. We should be grateful that such warriors have chosen to join us rather than conquer us." Commander Zethkar submitted his report and requested an extension of his assignment to Earth. For the first time in his military career, he had found warriors whose achievements made his own seem small by comparison. And for the first time in years, he felt like he could still learn something new about what it meant to be a soldier. The battle-scarred alien who had come to teach primitive humans about warfare realized that he had encountered the most formidable military culture in the galaxy. And perhaps, if he was very fortunate, they might teach him what it really meant to be a warrior.